Welcome. It is truly wonderful to see you all here today as we gather together to commemorate the start of this year. Now, for those of you who are seniors, this is the last lap of a journey through Williams that I imagine already feels a whole lot shorter than you expected it would. And for those of you in the graduate art program, it's either the beginning or the beginning of the end. And for those of you at the Center for Development Economics, you're 1 month into a short and incredibly intense experience. But wherever you are in your journey, your time remaining here at Williams isn't very long at all. And it's well worth asking what's best to do with that time and the opportunity that that time represents. And that's what I'd like to reflect with you on this afternoon or this morning. At the top of my summer reading list was Will Haygood's terrific biography of Thurgood Marshall, Showdown, Thurgood Marshall and the Supreme Court nomination that changed America. Possessed of an extraordinary legal mind and deft political understanding, Marshall is at the pinnacle of any list of 20th century figures whose work brought about transformational changes for America. He crafted the legal strategy that won Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, and in his career at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, he won a string of legal victories across the South that were critical to dismantling the evil system of de jure segregation that had oppressed Black Americans since Reconstruction. And he did this not from a comfortable law office in New York or Washington, but by traveling throughout the South and working with local activists, putting his very life on the line year after year. And then he was nominated to the federal bench, and in 1967 to the Supreme Court, where he became one of our country's greatest jurists. Another great legal mind who has worked successfully for remarkable change is Bryan Stevenson, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. Not only has EJI saved 125 people from the death penalty, Stevenson, a MacArthur Genius Grant winner, argued a case before the Supreme Court that declared unconstitutional the sentencing to life without parole of minors under 17. Stevenson was our commencement speaker this past June, where he gave a stirring address in which he exhorted Williams graduates to keep 5 key lessons in mind as they work to make change. And paraphrasing from his words, these lessons are: 1, work on your identity. There's power in our identities, especially when they are identities of commitment and compassion. When you create the kind of identity that means something to the people around you, you can change the world. 2, get proximate to the places and the people in your communities who are suffering. Get closer to the spaces and places where there's violence and poverty. In proximity, you will find a power. You can do more than you think you can do. 3, change the narrative. There are narratives behind all of the problems we talk about. The great evil of American slavery, for instance, wasn't just involuntary servitude, Stevenson said, but rather the narrative of racial differences we created to legitimize slavery, the ideology of white supremacy that has engendered decades of violence and terrorism. We've got to change that narrative. 4, stay hopeful. Hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Your hope is essential. Hope is what will get you to stand up when other people say sit down. Hope is what will get you to speak when other people say be quiet. Please stay hopeful. And 5, do something uncomfortable. You cannot change the world by doing only what's convenient and comfortable. To change the world, you're going to have to position yourself in difficult places and do uncomfortable things. Now, Thurgood Marshall, in his extraordinary career, exemplified each of these lessons. He was a highly educated Black man from Baltimore who remained rooted in his own identity and insisted that people respect him for who he was. He got close to the people he was working to help, traveling the South for decades to support local activists inside and outside the NAACP. He changed the narrative in essential ways, most importantly by insisting on the radical notion that the highest law of the land, the Constitution, is indeed on the side of justice and can be deployed to enforce justice. He stayed hopeful, enduring many defeats and injustices throughout his career, but always believing that his work would make a difference. And he certainly was prepared to be uncomfortable, passing up a safe law practice in New York for a calling that every day required great personal courage and peril. Now, like Marshall, Bryan Stevenson has exemplified these 5 directives in his life and work. And I encourage you to read his remarkable book, Just Mercy, if you want to know how. But I also took some other important lessons from his story. Be steadfast and be strategic. The road to justice is long and winding, and persistence is the key. Partial victories are victories. Don't be contemptuous of opportunities to get you part of the way. Seek allies, even imperfect ones. Achieving change and justice is a team sport. You'll need to work with people to get there, and some of them may not agree with you on everything you think. This does not matter. If you apply too high a standard of purity in choosing your allies, you'll do your work alone, and you'll fail. Third, listen, especially to people you disagree with. If they don't convince you, you'll learn something valuable about how you might convince them, or you'll learn to disagree with each other respectfully. Fourth, be prepared. Do your homework about the issues and recognize that everyone else at the table cares as much as you do about what's at stake. Know your audience. The goal of communication is to be understood, not to be smarter than the listener. Know the context in which you are speaking and speak in a way that will be clearest to those that you're trying to reach. And finally, know your history. No issue of any importance or complexity emerged 20 minutes ago, or 2 years ago, or even 10 years ago. Things are the way they are for some reason. Understand that history if you want to be able to change it. Now, someone who would have appreciated that last point especially is Professor Leslie Brown, whose passing last month has left us grieving both a deep personal loss and a profound loss for our community. In her decade at Williams, Leslie challenged our community in the most important ways to see ourselves as we are and to commit to becoming better. When she saw something that wasn't right, she never compromised her outrage about it. But expressing outrage wasn't the goal. Change was. As a scholar, she studied the history of the Black community in Durham, North Carolina, and analyzed how change had occurred there over centuries through the actions, good and bad, of institutions. History matters, and institutions matter, she reminded us. 2 years ago, after the summer in which Michael Brown was killed, Leslie spoke at a teach-in early in the fall. She discussed the history of lynching and other forms of racialized violence, and then asked the audience, how many of you plan one day to run for city council where you live? Not many hands went up. You see, she said, it's the city council that appoints the police chief. So if you want the power to insist that the police behave differently, protesting is a fine start, but you need to do something more than that, something that takes longer and produces change that lasts longer. Of course, all of these lessons from Thurgood Marshall, from Bryan Stevenson, and from Leslie Brown are true and important far beyond the realms of politics and the struggles for social justice. They are keys to being effective in the world, in whatever you choose to do. And of course, they are keys to being effective at Williams, in class, on teams, in clubs and organizations, and with each other in our community. So I urge you to use this last year at this college to practice these habits and to hone these skills. Do that, and you'll be learning some of the most important lessons that Williams has to offer. And have a wonderful year. So we will now hear from Sammy Stone and Gabe Morosky. Please welcome them.